Before the story begins, here's a question I can't stop thinking about. What would you do if everyone around you started dying and nobody, not your doctor, not your priest, not even your king, could tell you why? That's exactly where we're headed. And once you step into that world with me, you'll understand why the Black Death terrified people in a way that's almost impossible to imagine today. Today, we understand where the Black Death came from and what it really was. But if I were living in the Middle Ages, the plague wouldn't just be a deadly disease, it would be something completely beyond my ability to explain or understand. Back then, people had almost nothing to protect themselves. There were no effective ways to stop the disease from spreading, no social system strong enough to keep it under control, no medical knowledge that could explain what was happening, and no way of mentally preparing for a disaster on such an unimaginable scale. To me, it would have felt less like an illness and more like some kind of mysterious punishment sent from above, so overwhelming that it seemed to break every rule of nature and every bit of common sense. So let's go back together to the 14th century. As we step into that world, I want you to picture what it would really feel like. Imagine watching your family, your friends and your neighbours fall one after another, never knowing who will be next. Think about the fear of waking up each morning knowing it could be your turn. It would almost feel as if the world had turned into a cruel lottery where every single ticket was a losing one. The confusion would be overwhelming, the terror constant, and the helplessness almost impossible to put into words. But before we dive into today's story, let me ask you something. Picture yourself as a 15th century monk freezing in a scriptorium while spending hour after hour copying sacred manuscripts by hand. Eventually, boredom gets the better of you, your mind starts wandering, and before you know it, you've filled the edge of the page with the most ridiculous little creature imaginable. Then the abbot walks in. He takes one look at your bizarre drawing, and suddenly you have some explaining to do. That hilarious idea is exactly what inspired the fantastic card game Brother Y. It's a chaotic medieval party game built around real, wonderfully bizarre medieval marginalia, all reproduced on beautifully textured, high-quality cards. Every player receives a ridiculous character card along with an incredibly serious quote card. Your challenge is to come up with the funniest explanation for why your absurd little creation ended up beside such an important piece of writing. The creators at Hive Games have recently released Brother Y 1.5, introducing updated rules that make the game even smoother and easier for new players to jump into. I've been playing it with friends lately, and honestly, we've had an amazing time. It's incredibly easy to learn, works well with groups of almost any size, and quickly turns into one of those games where everyone is laughing before long. And if you're anything like the rest of us here at Medieval Madness and can't get enough of those wonderfully weird medieval manuscript drawings, I think you're going to have a blast with this game. The solo indie creator behind it is based not far from me here in England, and they've already sold a huge number of copies. For the first time, the game is now available in the United States, with releases across the rest of Europe coming soon. If you'd like to grab your own copy while directly supporting everything we do here at Medieval Madness, you'll find the link down below. If you end up picking one up, let me know in the comments. I'd genuinely love to hear what you think, because I've really been enjoying it myself. Now, without wasting another moment, what if I told you one siege may have helped unleash one of the deadliest disasters in human history? At first, the rumours came from a distant land that seemed too far away to matter, but before long that nightmare was sailing straight toward Europe, and nobody had any idea what was coming. The beginning of the end, one of the most vivid descriptions of the Black Death's arrival, comes from Gabriele de' Mussi in a manuscript known as The Great Dying. He wrote, "In 1346, throughout the lands of the East, countless Tartars and Saracens were struck by a mysterious sickness that brought sudden death. Great kingdoms, cities, towns and villages were overwhelmed by disease and consumed by terrible death until they were left almost completely empty of people." He went on to explain that Christian merchants who had been driven from the region were so terrified of the Tartar armies that they escaped with whatever they could save, boarding armed ships and fleeing to Kaffa, a Genoese settlement on the Crimean coast. Then the story took an even darker turn. According to de' Mussi, The heathen Tartar armies gathered from every direction, surrounded the city and kept it under siege for nearly 3 years. But while they were laying siege to Kaffa, something unexpected happened. A deadly illness swept through the attackers themselves, killing thousands upon thousands every single day. Nothing anyone tried could stop it. Medical treatments were completely useless. As soon as the first signs appeared, many of the infected were already doomed. Painful swellings formed beneath the arms and in the groin, followed by a burning fever as the disease rapidly consumed them. With so many soldiers dying, the siege began to fall apart. But before giving up, the Tartars reportedly made one final horrifying decision. They loaded the bodies of their dead into catapults and launched them over the city walls. According to the account, enormous numbers of rotting corpses crashed into Kaffa. The air became foul, the water was believed to be contaminated, and people feared that even a single infected person could spread the deadly poison to countless others. No one knew how to defend themselves because no one understood what they were facing. Dehmusi continued by saying that nearly everyone who had travelled through the east or the lands to its north and south eventually fell victim to this terrifying disease. The death toll was so immense and the suffering so unimaginable that many survivors became convinced the Last Judgment had finally arrived. Kaffa happened to be one of the most important trading ports connecting Asia and Europe, according to Dehmusi. Only a few sailors escaped by ship, but they carried the deadly disease with them. Without realizing it, those ships became floating death traps. They crossed the Mediterranean, heading for ports like Genoa, Venice, and other Christian cities. As Dehmusi described it, when the sailors arrived and mixed with the local people, it was as though they had brought evil spirits with them. Before long, city after city was overwhelmed. Entire communities were infected. Men and women died suddenly, and once someone became sick, the disease often spread through their entire household. Even the people who came to prepare the dead for burial frequently caught the illness themselves and died in the same terrible way. It must have felt as though death itself had slipped through every door and every window. As towns emptied and families disappeared, the survivors were left grieving neighbours almost as often as their own loved ones.
Now, historians still debate just how reliable Dehmusi's account really is. We can't say for certain that the pandemic truly began with plague-infected bodies being thrown over the walls of Kaffa. What we do know, however, is beyond dispute. The plague spread with incredible speed along the well-established trade routes that connected continents.
Once it found those pathways, it moved across them like wildfire. Sometime during 1346, the first unsettling rumours began drifting into Europe. People heard strange stories about a terrible sickness spreading somewhere far away in the east. To the average medieval European, those reports probably sounded distant, like something happening in another world that could never reach them. But that illusion didn't last. By the spring of 1348, the plague had arrived in Sicily. Soon afterward, it reached the European mainland, and everything was about to change. The Black Death didn't march into Europe with an army. It slipped in almost unnoticed, carried by something so tiny that no one would have given it a second glance, and that little hitchhiker was about to change history forever. The little things. When the plague reached the port of Messina on the Italian island of Sicily, it most likely arrived on the back of a filthy black rat. Hidden deep within the rat's fur was a flea so small it was barely bigger than the tiny punctuation marks a medieval monk might place on the pages of a manuscript. Yet inside that almost invisible insect lived hundreds of thousands of Yersinia pestis bacteria quietly waiting for their next opportunity. The flea itself was perfectly designed for feeding. Its sharp bayonet-like mouthpart worked almost like a tiny hypodermic needle, piercing the skin so it could drink blood with ease. As if that wasn't efficient enough, it also released an anticoagulant into the wound, keeping the blood flowing smoothly instead of clotting. It was like turning on a faucet that simply refused to shut off. Of course, the flea had no idea it was about to become one of the most infamous travellers in medieval history. Then there was the black rat itself, often called the house rat or the ship rat. Mostly active at night, it was one of nature's greatest survivors. These animals were remarkably resilient. Rats have even been discovered swimming in the open sea days after the ships they were riding had already sunk. Unlike humans, a rat could sometimes carry a moderate amount of Yersinia pestis without appearing seriously ill at first, but the bacteria multiplied at an astonishing pace. Their numbers exploded into the millions, spreading faster than either the rats or the fleas that carried them. Eventually, once the infection reached the rat's lungs or nervous system, there was no coming back. The animal usually died a violent death, often racked by convulsions during its final moments. And that's when the real danger began. As the rat died, the fleas feeding on its blood suddenly received a massive dose of the plague bacteria. Their host was now dead, and the body quickly began to cool. Fleas hate the cold, so they did the only thing that made sense to them. They jumped off the lifeless rat and started searching for another warm body to feed on. Imagine waking up with what feels like an ordinary fever, telling yourself you'll be fine by tomorrow. Then day by day, your own body begins turning against you, and you realize there's nothing anyone can do to stop what's coming. Creeping death. As more infected ships reached the port of Messina, people throughout the city began falling sick. At first, the illness seemed almost ordinary. It usually started with a pounding headache and an overwhelming sense of weakness. Before long, a high fever followed, leaving people with the horrifying sensation that their blood was boiling beneath their skin. Then the symptoms became far more severe. Victims were struck with relentless nausea and vomiting, aching joints and violent chills that shook their entire bodies. Soon after came a racing heartbeat, growing confusion, slurred speech, and in many cases terrifying hallucinations. For many sufferers, a dark blister appeared where the infected flea had bitten them. Around the third day, another unmistakable sign emerged. The lymph nodes began to swell dramatically, most often in the neck, the armpits, or the groin, and sometimes in all three places at once. Because flea bites commonly happened on the legs, the swelling in the groin was usually the most severe. These swollen masses, known as buboes, could grow to alarming sizes. When they burst or were opened, they released blood and pus. In fact, the word bubo comes from the Greek word bubon, meaning groin, which is how the disease eventually became known as the bubonic plague. Meanwhile, the body was fighting a battle it couldn't win. The heart beat faster and faster, desperately trying to force blood through inflamed tissue. At the same time, tiny purple spots began appearing beneath the skin as the infection spread deeper through the body. As the disease advanced, it attacked the nervous system as well. The pain became almost unbearable, accompanied by a disturbing collection of neurological symptoms. Some victims suffered involuntary muscle spasms and uncontrollable twisting movements, grim sights that may even have helped inspire the eerie dance of death traditions that became so widespread during the plague years. By the fourth or fifth day, many people experienced something just as frightening as the physical suffering itself. An overwhelming sense of terror would wash over them as they realized what was happening. But eventually, for many, that fear gave way to something else. As the body continued to deteriorate and death became impossible to escape, a quiet acceptance often settled in. In the end, death no longer seemed like the enemy. It became the only release from the unimaginable suffering the plague had brought. At first, the ships looked like a blessing. They promised wealth, trade, and exciting goods from distant lands. But within days, everyone realized those ships had delivered something far more valuable and infinitely more terrifying than anyone could have imagined. Release the panic. When the ships first sailed into the harbour at Messina, the townspeople were happy to see them. After all, arriving merchant vessels usually meant valuable spices, rare goods, and exotic cargo from distant parts of the world. They were a welcome sight, but that excitement didn't last long. Within just a few days, it became painfully obvious that the ships had brought far more than merchandise. They had carried a disaster that was spreading with terrifying speed. People began dying. As the number of victims climbed, the people of Messina quickly connected the dots. They realized the source of their sudden catastrophe was the sick and dying sailors still aboard the ships rocking gently in the harbour. Panic took over. The frightened townspeople turned on the crews, forcing the infected ships back out to sea. It must have seemed like the only way to save themselves. Instead, it only made things worse. Those same ships simply sailed to new ports, unknowingly carrying the plague to fresh populations that had no idea what was about to happen. Meanwhile, Messina itself was descending into complete chaos. People fled in every direction. Some escaped into the countryside, others disappeared into vineyards or neighbouring villages, desperately believing that putting distance between themselves and the city would keep them safe. But they were unknowingly bringing the real culprits with them, the rats and the fleas riding on them. Many of the people fleeing Messina were already infected, while others had only just begun the disease's slow, deadly progression. As they travelled roughly 55 miles south to the town of Catania, they were welcomed with sympathy and kindness. The people there did what any compassionate community might have done. They opened their doors, they offered hospital beds, they cared for the sick. It was an act of genuine generosity, and one they would soon regret. Before long, the plague began spreading through Catania as well. The town's compassion disappeared almost overnight. The gates were effectively closed and no more outsiders were allowed in. Looking back, it's hard to blame them for trying. The problem was, they acted far too late. As the disease progressed, those who were sick stopped being viewed with pity and increasingly became objects of fear and revulsion. Their bodies darkened, they stumbled through the streets in delirium, and many people recoiled from them as though their very presence polluted the air around them. The illness transformed every part of the body. A powerful, sickening odour surrounded the victims. Their sweat, their breath, their saliva, and even their waste carried an overwhelming stench that people found almost unbearable. Even their urine changed in appearance, becoming cloudy, unusually thick, and sometimes turning dark red or nearly black. To those watching with no understanding of disease, it must have looked as though the dead were already beginning to walk, long before death had finally claimed them. It's one thing to read about the Black Death in a history book. It's another to imagine waking up every morning wondering if today would be the day your family disappeared forever, and the most terrifying part, the people living through it had no idea when or if it would ever end. Trying to understand the fear. Today, it's incredibly difficult for me to truly grasp the level of fear people experienced during the Black Death. The closest comparison I can think of is the early days of COVID, when nobody really understood what was happening. People didn't know who was most at risk, how dangerous the disease actually was, or what the future would look like. Even then, we still had modern medicine, advanced hospitals, and centuries of scientific knowledge to rely on. That experience only gives us the faintest glimpse of what medieval people were forced to endure. For them, there were no real answers, no effective treatments, no understanding of what caused the disease. What made everything even more terrifying was the speed of it all. The plague seemed to appear out of nowhere. Someone could go to bed feeling completely healthy, only to be found dead the following morning. As fear spread, so did the stories. Rumours travelled almost as quickly as the disease itself. People whispered that priests who comforted the sick could become infected from a single touch, and sometimes die even before the people they had come to help. Entire households shut themselves inside. Many families marked their doors with painted crosses, warning everyone outside that someone within had fallen victim to the plague. Desperation drove people to try almost anything if they believed it might save them. Some bathed themselves in urine. Others stood near foul-smelling latrines, convinced that breathing the terrible odour could somehow protect them from the disease, and some resorted to even more disturbing remedies, including drinking the pus taken from plague victims' swollen buboes, believing it might somehow prevent infection. Across Italy, scenes of devastation became almost impossible to comprehend. In Siena, stray dogs reportedly dug up corpses from shallow graves and dragged partially eaten bodies into the streets. In Venice, it was believed that as many as 600 people were dying every single day. And in Milan, authorities took an especially brutal approach. If someone inside a house became infected, the entire family could be sealed inside the building, whether the others were sick or perfectly healthy. Imagine being a child trapped behind those walls. Imagine sitting beside the bodies of your parents as they slowly decomposed in the summer heat, surrounded by flies with no way to escape. Imagine crying for help day after day, only to slowly starve because no one dared come near. The plague continued its relentless advance across mainland Europe. By the summer of 1348, it had reached the English ports of Southampton and Bristol, both of which remained in constant contact with the continent through trade. The people living there had almost certainly heard the horrifying reports arriving from Europe. Perhaps some believed the plague was God's punishment for the sins of other nations and hoped England might somehow be spared. It was an understandable hope, but it was also tragically misplaced. As the chronicler Geoffrey the Baker later recorded, in the 7th year after it began, it came to England, first appearing in the towns and ports along the seacoast. It left the country almost empty of people. Eventually it reached Gloucester, Oxford and London, and finally spread across all England, destroying so many that scarcely 1 person in 10 remained alive. The Black Death would go on to become one of the greatest catastrophes in human history, forever changing Europe, its people, and the course of civilization itself. Thank you so much for watching this episode of Medieval Madness. If you enjoyed today's journey into history, I'd really appreciate it if you subscribe to the channel. I upload a brand new medieval history video every week, covering fascinating stories, forgotten events, and the incredible people who shaped the Middle Ages. And if you'd like even more content, you can join us on Patreon, where I release an exclusive bonus episode every month. You'll also unlock every bonus episode that's already been published, all while directly supporting the work that goes into creating these videos. For those who'd like to support the channel even further, there's also a higher membership tier where your name appears in the credits at the end of future episodes. Thanks again for spending your time with me. I truly appreciate every one of you. Until next week, take care of yourselves, and I hope you have an amazing week.